My name is Dahlia, and I am 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, my father had a name for me that followed me, like a shadow no matter where I stood or how hard. I tried to step into the light. The problem child. It was never said in passing, never as a joke, never with affection. It was a label, a verdict, a quiet sentence handed down in living rooms, at dinner tables, during family gatherings where laughter echoed for everyone except me. When I spilled juice at 6, I was the problem child. When my grades slipped during the year my mother fell sick, I was the problem child. When my older brother got into trouble but somehow walked away untarnished, the tension still found its way to me because somehow, everything always circled back to Dahlia, the problem child. I grew up believing there must be something fundamentally wrong with me. Something invisible yet obvious to everyone else. Something that justified the way my father's voice hardened whenever he said my name. He never hit me, never screamed in the dramatic ways movies like to portray cruelty, but his disappointment was colder, sharper, more precise. It lived in the sighs, the dismissive glances, the comparisons that sliced deeper than any raised hand ever could. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" was practically the soundtrack of my childhood. A question that needed no answer because the accusation inside it was already complete. I spent years trying to earn a version of love that always felt conditional, always just out of reach, like a door that opened for everyone else but closed the moment I approached. I became quiet, careful, hyper-aware of every word I spoke and every step I took, yet nothing I did seemed to rewrite the story my father had already decided about me. By my teenage years, the label had turned into identity. Relatives repeated it casually. Teachers sensed it indirectly, and I carried it like a weight stitched into my skin. Even my successes were treated like temporary accidents. When I won an academic award, my father simply nodded and said, "Let's see how long this lasts," as if failure were my natural state and achievement an amusing anomaly. I told myself that one day I would prove him wrong, though I never fully understood what wrong even meant. Because how do you argue against a perception that has defined you since birth? The older I grew, the more I noticed the strange distance between my father and me, a gap that felt different from ordinary favoritism. There was something else, something unspoken, something that made his resentment feel less like frustration and more like certainty. He looked at me, not as if I disappointed him, but as if I confirmed something he had always believed. My mother, on the other hand, loved me fiercely but with a nervous tenderness, as though she were constantly trying to compensate for a wound she could not heal. There were moments I caught her staring at me with an expression I could never quite decode. Mixture of sadness and fear that vanished whenever I asked what was wrong. Our home was filled with normal routines and quiet fractures, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, tensions that hummed beneath ordinary days. I learned to survive inside that atmosphere by shrinking parts of myself, by becoming agreeable, by trying to be so little trouble that the word problem would finally lose its grip on me. But it never did. It followed me into adulthood, into my choices, into relationships where I constantly over-apologized for simply existing. Then, not long before my 28th birthday, a series of small, seemingly insignificant events began to disturb the fragile balance of my life. It started with a comment from an aunt at a family gathering, a careless remark about how I never really looked like my father anyway, followed by awkward laughter and my mother's sudden silence. I had heard variations of that observation before, but this time something about it lodged itself deeper, refusing to be brushed aside. I began to replay memories, to notice patterns, to question things I had long accepted as unchangeable truths. Why did my father's hostility toward me feel so personal, so absolute? Why did my mother carry that persistent undercurrent of guilt in her eyes? Questions I had buried for years began clawing their way to the surface, unsettling and relentless. What began as curiosity soon turned into a quiet obsession, a need to understand the invisible tension that had shaped my entire existence. I did not yet know that this search for clarity would lead me toward a revelation, capable of shattering everything. I thought I knew about my family, my past, and even myself. I did not yet know that the words, "My dad called me the problem child?" For 29 years, then the DNA results came. would one day feel less like a dramatic title and more like the most accurate summary of my life. All I knew was that something did not add up, that beneath decades of strained affection and silent hurt lay a truth, waiting with terrifying patience, a truth that would soon demand to be seen. For weeks after that gathering, the thought refused to leave me alone. It crept into my mornings, sat beside me at work, echoed through my quiet apartment at night. I told myself I was being irrational, that families were complicated, that resemblance meant nothing. But doubt, once awakened, has a way of feeding on silence. I started noticing details I had ignored my entire life. How my father's features were stamped clearly onto my brother, yet absent from me. How relatives hesitated before making comments about my looks. How my mother always changed the subject when childhood photos were discussed. The questions grew louder until they became impossible to suppress. One evening, driven by a mixture of fear and desperate curiosity, I ordered a DNA test. Even as I clicked the confirmation button, my hands trembled. It felt like betrayal, like I was accusing my own mother of something unspeakable. Yet it also felt like the only path toward understanding a lifetime of emotional distance. When the test kit arrived, I stared at it for a long time before opening it, fully aware that whatever lay inside, those results had the power to either quiet my suspicions forever or detonate my reality. The waiting period was unbearable. Every day stretched endlessly, filled with a strange tension I could not share with anyone. I avoided my parents' calls. Not out of anger, but out of a growing sense that I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. Then the email finally came. I remember the exact moment. The dim light of my kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I clicked. I read. And the world, as I knew it, fractured in complete silence. The man who had raised me, criticized me, labeled me for nearly 3 decades, was not biologically related to me. My father, the man who had called me the problem child for 29 years, was not my father at all. I reread the screen again and again, convinced there must be some mistake, some misinterpretation, some technical error, but the numbers did not change. The truth was cold, clinical, undeniable. Shock gave way to a cascade of emotions too tangled to name. Confusion, grief, anger, an aching sense of dislocation. Suddenly, memories rearranged themselves into a pattern I could no longer ignore. The distance. The resentment. The strange certainty in his disappointment. It was as if an invisible script had been running beneath my life, and I had only just been handed the missing pages. I confronted my mother that same night. I did not plan it. I simply drove to my childhood home, the printed results clenched in my shaking hands. When she opened the door and saw my face, something in her expression collapsed before I said a single word. I placed the paper between us, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Tears filled her eyes instantly, not of surprise but of recognition, of a secret finally cornered. Through broken sentences and trembling breaths, the story emerged. Before she married my father, there had been someone else. A relationship she believed was over. A truth she never had the courage to reveal. My father had known. Not from the beginning, but early enough for the knowledge to seep into everything. He had chosen to stay, to raise me, but the betrayal had hardened inside him like stone, and I, an innocent child, had become the living reminder of a wound he never healed. The label problem child was never about my behavior, my mistakes, or my worth. It was about pain that had nothing to do with me. Anger displaced onto the safest target. The revelation was devastating, yet it carried a strange, piercing clarity. The mystery of my childhood was no longer a mystery. The tension finally had a name. When I later sat across from my father, the air between us thick with decades of unspoken truth, I saw not the distant, critical man of my memories, but someone visibly diminished by regret. He did not deny the results. He did not defend himself. His voice, when he finally spoke, lacked its familiar edge. He admitted the bitterness he had carried, the unfairness of his treatment, the terrible ease of turning unresolved hurt into quiet cruelty. For the first time in my life, I saw his certainty crack. The narrative that had defined me, Dahlia, the problem child, dissolved in the face of something far more tragic and human. The pain did not vanish, nor did the years magically repair themselves. But the truth shifted something fundamental inside me. I was never inherently flawed, never destined to disappoint, never the source of the fracture that shaped my family. I was simply a child born into a secret, too heavy for any household, to carry without consequence. Understanding did not erase the scars, but it freed me from the identity I had worn like a sentence. And if there is anything my story has taught me, it is this. The roles assigned to us in families are not always reflections of who we are, but often echoes of battles we never fought.